Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another week of the class Intro to the Talmud to anyone who would like to learn about it. I wanted to start this week with a little bit of review, Hazara, as we say in Hebrew, which is very important to make sure that we remember everything that we learned from last time. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and you'll see here, I wanted to just review um, the some of the things that we talked about with regard to modern Jewish life. That's kind of important in order to understand where we're going. What's going on here? Okay. Um, well, okay, I'm trying to move something on my screen, but it's not working. Here we go. So here's a map of the Jewish world. I don't know exactly if this has any sort of date to it, but it's mostly just to show you the divisions that we were talking about vis-a-vis ethnic divisions in Jewish life. And the yellow is what's called Sephardic Judaism or Sephardic Jewry. And the green is Ashkenazi. Most Jews in the United States are descended from Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Lithuania, Russia, that kind of thing. Less numbers from Germany and things like that. And then the yellow is Sephardic Jewry, which comes from Spain. Sepharad means Spain in Hebrew. Obviously, not living in Spain for quite some time since the Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain in 1492. But so Sephardic Jewry goes through Morocco, Egypt, Syria, Turkey, etc., throughout the Middle East. There's also some Sephardic Jews in Italy and Greece, less numerous, but still there. And so we were mentioning those divisions, and I found this map to be helpful to understand where those divisions are. And within modern Jewish life, so in the United States, it's going to be more affected by Ashkenazi Jewry. In Israel, there's a larger Sephardic population that has emerged from after the foundation of the state of Israel. There was migration, we could say, of Middle Eastern Jews to Israel. So there's a larger population of Sephardic Jews in Israel. And then we also briefly talked about the modern Jewish denominations, which there are three. And it's important to note that denominations only exist in Ashkenazic Jewry. They don't, Sephardic Jewry doesn't have the movements or denominations as they're called. So if we switch over to this one, this is just a recap of the denominations that exist. So in contrast to Christianity and similar to Islam, there are three main denominations of Judaism. The largest denomination in the United States is Reform Judaism, which is liberal in orientation and somewhat similar to these are obviously kind of broad generalizations, but similar to mainline Protestantism. Then conservative Judaism is sort of the second largest in the United States, and it's not conservative politically, but it has to do with how it approaches to Jewish law, which we'll see more later how that plays out. And then Orthodox Judaism is what most people are familiar with, particularly the black hat people like this. This is probably what you think of when you think of, or a lot of people think of this when they think of Judaism. So, but it's actually a very small community, usually in New York, some other areas where there's a large population of ultra Orthodox or Haredi Jews. There's other shades of Orthodoxy. Modern Orthodox is probably the largest subgroup of Orthodoxy, but there are other groups too that you can see here. There are a few other denominations that are not that big, but there are a few other ones. But so that's just kind of the modern Jewish landscape for just to kind of have some orientation as to what it looks like now. And I'll just keep going here. So that's modern Jewish life, and then we have to rewind quite a bit here. And this gets us back to where we were talking about last time, which was the Mishnah. And this is just a timeline of the when rabbinic Judaism, when things happened in rabbinic Judaism, more or less. So the rabbinic Judaism is really a response to the war with Rome, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the what happens because of that. So rabbinic Judaism is really a survival mechanism for the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple, and then after the Bar Kokhba revolt, when it's quite obvious that there's not going to be a new temple rebuilt, and it's out of that kind of chaos that rabbinic Judaism is really born. Most scholars assume that there's some connection with the Pharisees, although it's hard to establish exactly because there's no writings from the Pharisees that claim to be written by Pharisees, more or less. So it's kind of hard to know exactly, but there's general consensus, more or less, that there's some sort of overlap between those two, between the rabbis and the Pharisees, although it's not exactly understood all of the contours of that relationship. And then so we were looking at the Mishnah, which is composed around 200 CE. And we remembered that the Mishnah is a library of texts, not really one text. So it probably took a bit of time to compile all of that material. I'll pause for a second and just if anyone has any comments or questions to ask or anything to say at this point. Okay, good. So we're up to speed on that. And so this is where we spent most of our time last time. This is obviously, this diagram is not the best, but it's just, it just helps to kind of see the transition from different points in the what we would call the rabbinic corpus. And so the first layer here is the written Bible, and then the midrash is not these things here are not so important in terms of what we're doing. But so we go to the Mishnah, which is what we looked at last time. And so today we're going to kind of unpack a little bit more about the Mishnah and understand it a little bit more with looking at the two different Talmuds. So remember, the Jerusalem Talmud is the first Talmud, which was written around maybe 400 or so, as we say, and then the Babylonian Talmud maybe around 500, hard to date, and the location is what it refers to. So even though it wasn't written in Jerusalem, it's called the Jerusalem Talmud. It was really written in the Galilee region of Israel, but for whatever reason, that name stuck. And then Bavli just means Babylonian, so it means from Iraq, Iran, that kind of area. So that's what we were looking at today. I want to just introduce the Tosefta really kind of briefly, and also look at the Jerusalem Talmud. So we were looking the last week at the first Mishnah in the entire Mishnah, which has to do with the Shema. And I realized we probably should have looked at the actual Shema. So I want to just show you what the Shema is. And so we'll jump over here for a second. And so this is just the prayer book. Siddur is the prayer book, where you would have these texts where you would use them in a practical sense. So the Shema is this part right here. And so it comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. So it's Hear, O Israel. And usually they say, like, the Lord is how it will be translated in English translations. The Lord is our God. The Lord is one. There's a lot of different ways to understand what that means. And I think if you click that, it tells you all about what some different things there. And then so that's the first part of the Shema. And then it goes down and there's more parts to it. And this part you probably are familiar with too. And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your possession. This says possession. There's different ways of translating that. And so it keeps going, blah, blah, blah. And then it has 3 paragraphs. So this one is probably less known, but it's also from, I believe this is from Deuteronomy 2. And it has to do with sort of you could call it kind of like a reward and punishment kind of thing, where it's like, if you do these commandments, then you'll have good agriculture, basically. And then the last part is here, which is from Numbers. And so this is the last part. So you would basically recite these 3 paragraphs in the morning and the evening. The text of them is not so important, but just so you could kind of familiarize yourself with it and see what it looks like. It includes some important themes. The monotheism bit. It mentions the several commandments of wearing tzitzit or fringes, which is like the prayer shawl that you might have seen before that is worn during prayer. It also has memory of being led out of Egypt. That's an important concept. So just to have that in mind as we review the first Mishnah over here, which is the question is, and the thing that is trying to be decided is when do you have in the evening, what is the time that you have, your time frame to say the text, the 3 paragraphs that I was just showing you. So there was 3 opinions that were mentioned. The first one is from Rabbi Eliezer, which says that you have from when the priests go to enter and to eat the terumah, which is a form of tithing that was given from the produce that you produced from your crops for the year, basically. And so they would eat it at a certain time of the day in the evening. So that's basically what that means. The second opinion is what the rabbis say as a group, which they say you have until midnight. And then Rabban Gamliel says you have until dawn. And so then after that, there was the story about the sons of Rabban Gamliel who were having a good time at the wedding and they forgot to say it. And he tells them that they have it, if it's not done yet, then they can still say the Shema paragraphs that I showed you, and they would be able to have fulfilled their obligation to do that. And then the last paragraph that we saw was why do the rabbis or the sages say that you have until midnight? Or why do they, if you have until dawn, why do they say only until midnight? And that's basically to give you a buffer zone, so you basically don't get close to that deadline and forget. I think you'll see that we're going to look at some other texts today that will show this a little bit, but that the rabbinic mindset is very cognizant of human psychology. So you can see with that here with the giving of the buffer zones, they are aware that people will forget things, and so they kind of know that if you say like that something is due, let's say you're thinking of like a school assignment or something is due at midnight on Tuesday, a lot of people will wait until 11:30 to start working on it. So that's kind of what's going on here. They're saying, well, you actually have until dawn, but we're going to say midnight, so you kind of finish earlier. So that's what we were looking at last time. I wanted to show you briefly the Tosefta, which is not that important in terms of like a kind of day-to-day practical thing, but it is interesting in terms of the composition of the Mishnah. It's used in a way like the synoptic problem with the Gospels to understand how the Mishnah was composed. And so there's different theories about it. Typically, you'll see, if you just Google Tosefta, you'll see that it's a commentary to the Mishnah. That's the word commentary is used a lot, even though it's not necessarily the best word. But there's a scholar who has worked on this, and I'm forgetting her name right now, but I think it's Judith Hauptmann or something like that, who basically uses the Tosefta. And so we'll kind of see this here. And she compares the Mishnah version of the question, and she compares it to the Tosefta. And she believes that the Tosefta is actually working from like an earlier, she calls it an Ur Mishnah, like kind of like, I guess you could call it like the people familiar with the gospel theories it would be kind of like the Q version of the Mishnah. So, and there's some textual evidence from the Talmud that this was kind of how this text came to be. That it was compiled from different, more or less notebooks from different rabbis who had taken notes during different periods of time, and it was kind of compiled together in this way. But let's look here. So the question, of course, is from when do you have to recite the Shema in the evening? And the Mishnah, we were just saying, was the 3 opinions that we had there. And so if you look over at the Tosefta, you'll see they have a different set of opinions. So they have the first one is from when people come home to eat their bread on Shabbat on Friday evening. You have to eat bread on Shabbat. It's part of the ritual. You have wine and bread. That there's a ceremony to mark the beginning of Shabbat. So this is from a different. You can see here it says from Rabbi Meir. So the texts are answering the same question, but with a different conclusion or a different opinion, more or less. So, and then the Tosefta version says, and the Hachamim, the sages, the rabbis say, from the time when the Kohanim are able to eat their terumah. So here you can see there's a discrepancy between what the rabbis say in the Mishnah, which is until midnight, and here in the Tosefta they say until the priests eat their terumah, which is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer over here. So you can see it's a different version of this discussion that is trying to answer the same question, but it is kind of it's coming at it from a slightly different angle. So I just wanted to show you that it's not practically that important in terms of how you would use the Tosefta, and it doesn't really come into play very often practically, but it's interesting from like an academic point of view to see how these texts might have been composed. All right, so that's the Tosefta. It's an interesting alternative version of the Mishnah, I guess we could say. That's probably the best way to phrase it. I think last time we looked at the Talmud a little bit, so I want to just show you the Jerusalem Talmud. We can compare and contrast both here. Let me open this one, and let me open the Jerusalem Talmud. Jerusalem. Okay, here we go. Once we do that, okay, now we should be able to see everything. All right, so over here on the left, we have the Mishnah, which is what we were just reviewing. In the middle, we have 400 CE Jerusalem Talmud. And on the right, we're going to have the 500 CE Babylonian Talmud. So let me just find where it starts. Here we go. Okay, so after the Mishnah, with all the things that we were just reviewing, the Jerusalem Talmud starts with the analysis. So the Gemara, what they call halacha in Jerusalem Talmud is the analysis. So it's basically like it answers different questions about the Mishnah. Why was it written this way? We have three opinions here. Which one is the correct one? Things like that. So in the Jerusalem Talmud, it starts like this, and it says, when does one start to read the Shema in the evening? And it says, we have stated from the time the priest come to eat their terumah. This is actually from the Tosefta, if you remember. But hold on, let's see. I didn't want that to do that. Okay. I have to be careful when I click it. Doesn't like that. Okay. All right. So then they say Rabbi Hiya stated from the time that people come on their houses to eat their meal. We have stated that their opinions are almost identical. Come and see. So we're just going to compare just textually what is going on here. And I don't know if I clearly stated this before, but in the Babylonian Talmud, anything that's in bold is directly translated from the Hebrew, and the other is the regular font is kind of like commentary to help you understand it. But if you just look at the bold, it says, so we compare all of this. As you can see, there's more text in Hebrew and Aramaic. On the basis of what does the Tanna teach from when? So that's kind of strange, but it's referring to the first word over here, from when. So it's like, why is this the first question? Then it goes down here. What distinguishes evening from the like, why do we say the evening first instead of the morning? I just wanted to make clear that the Babylonian Talmud is more studied, so that's why it has all of this material to help you understand it. But I'm just focusing on the bold text because that's actually translated from Hebrew and Aramaic. And typically you'll see that the Jerusalem Talmud is a little bit harder to understand. This is attributed to a few different reasons, which is it was the first text, so it kind of has the disadvantage of being the first. It's typically traditionally assumed to have been composed kind of under duress, under a stressful time. So it wasn't like it didn't have the advantage of being edited as well as the Babylonian Talmud. The Jews in Iraq and Iran and in the Babylonian area were not under religious stress that the Jews in Palestine were. In Palestine, the Byzantines were the force that was in charge while the Jerusalem Talmud was being composed. And it was obviously the relationship between Judaism and Christianity is more tense. And in Babylon, it would have been Zoroastrianism, which didn't really have any sort of conflict with Judaism, more or less. So there was more freedom to edit the text and make it flow better. But so I'll just take a minute to pause here. If anyone has a comment or question or anything, while there's a lot of material on the screen.
So for the Jerusalem Talmud, is the whole text what's in the original Hebrew? Because I know you said the bold in the Babylonian Talmud is original Hebrew, and the rest is kind of just kind of help us along,
Yeah.
follow the idea.
Yeah. So you can see here that there's more text, and here it's also just the way they break it up too. But the way they have translated on this page, you'll see that they have they have notes like this.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you look on your own, if you just want to explore it, you'll note in the Jerusalem Talmud, it will have the notes that explain it instead of the like distinction in the fonts or that they use.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Just want to get
Yeah.
some clarity on that.
Yeah. Good question. Any other comments? Okay, so I think what we'll do, because this is, we don't, I just kind of wanted to show you these texts and how they're different, not with the intent of really analyzing this in depth. So what I'm going to do now is jump over for a second and do a little bit more history. So I want to show two different texts. Give me a second to pull everything up here. So I'm going to go to a part of the Mishnah, which is called Pirkei Avot. And this is a collection of non-legal material. It's typically translated as the sayings of the fathers. And it has a series of ethical statements that you'll see in a second. And I'm also going to go over here. And so we're going to look at two texts. They're very different in terms of when they were composed, but they're going to be working with the same material in kind of a different way. You'll see once we start getting into this. So on the first screen we had from the Mishnah, the ethical statements. This is a text that's traditionally studied in this time of the year between Passover and what's called Shavuot, which is actually Pentecost in what the actual holiday of Pentecost is. So it's typically studied during this time. And then over here, we have a later text from the 12th century, more or less, from Maimonides. You probably heard of Moses Maimonides, a very famous philosopher from Spain who left to live in Egypt. And his famous philosophical work was the Guide for the Perplexed. He was also a doctor for the Egyptian authorities of the Ottoman Empire, I believe it would have been. No, maybe not Ottoman yet, but whatever the secular government was in Egypt, he was a physician to that, like the court. But he was also a person who composed an important work in terms of Jewish law, which is called Mishneh Torah, which is actually a phrase that's used this to describe the book of Deuteronomy, and it means a repetition of the Torah. So this was like the first attempt to codify Jewish law. The Mishnah is not codified. It doesn't tell it. If you want to understand, like, what do I need to do in this case? Like, for example, if you need to ask the question that we were asking, when do I have until to say the evening Shema? The Mishnah doesn't really tell you a concrete answer, and the Talmud doesn't often tell you that either, because it's kind of meant to be studied with someone. So what Maimonides did is he codified the law to make it easy to find out what you need to do. And so we could go to the Mishnah Torah. Let's just do that just so you can kind of see. And we could find out, let's say we wanted to learn about the Shema. We would see here, and we could see it says here we are obligated to recite the Shema twice daily, in the evening, in the morning, when you lie down. So it's going to tell you very easily when you need to do this. So when people are accustomed to sleep, that's when you say the evening one, right? And it tells you easily, so you understand what you need to do. So that's what it means by codification. But in the first part, he's going to have something that's overlapping what we're going to see in the in Pirkei Avot. And I'm going to start with Pirkei Avot because it's older. So this is from 200 CE, more or less. The dates, obviously, we're not 100% sure when it was composed or anything like that, the exact dates, but something like that. And when you hear, like, for example, in the Gospels, when they're talking about the traditions of the fathers, it might be something related to this that they're actually kind of referring to, which is the chain of transmission of the oral Torah. So let's just look at this a little bit here, and this helps you kind of understand what the Mishnah is and what the Talmud is. So it says here, it's Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. So Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Mesorah means like transmit, hand down, that kind of thing. So Yehoshua is Joshua, and Joshua transmitted it to the elders, Zekanim, and the elders transmitted to the prophets, Nevi'im, and the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. And so what is the Great Assembly? This is what we might call like a mythical kind of history. We're not sure that, this is not really what happened per se. But this is how the rabbis understood the origin of their traditions. So Moses, so I would read this as a rabbinization of Jewish history, reinterpreting Jewish history, or Israelite history, we could say more accurately, within a rabbinic framework. So Moses is kind of the lawgiver, and he starts the transmission of the understanding of the two Torahs that we talked about, the written and the oral. So it's passed down, and you can see also that the prophets, so this is like Isaiah, Jeremiah, all of the prophets in the Bible, are understood to be part of the rabbinic transmission process. So they're actually, we'll see later that they are actually to be understood to like have been their own rabbis with their own courts and their own like law kind of thing. We'll see that in the medieval text in a little bit. So so what it does is it's going to show us the transmission of the oral Torah, and it's going to give us a little bit kind of like an ethical statement to go with each segment of history. So the first thing that we see here is what I'm going to emphasize today, which is the men of the Great Assembly. And this is kind of an assembly, a mythical assembly, more or less. We're not really sure that this actually existed, but it's imagined to be somewhat kind of in the time of Ezra, maybe, or a little bit later. It's kind of depends on how you understand it historically, what it refers to. But anyway, the ethical statement that goes with it is: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. So when you go back and you look at the first Mishnah and the Talmud that goes with it, you can see this at work, because we saw the rabbi's opinion is that you have until dawn to say what you need to say, but they're going to say that you only have until midnight. This is what's called a fence around the Torah. So it means that when you have a commandment that you need to do, the rabbis are always going to put some extra like boundaries around it. So to make sure that you don't mistake and end up transgressing a biblical commandment. So this is what is going to be called a biblical commandment versus a rabbinic commandment. So the biblical prohibition is, in the case of the Shema, that you have to say the Shema in the evening. So the rabbis create a circle around it and say you have only until midnight, so that you're more forced to make sure that you do that and you don't transgress a biblical commandment by forgetting to say it. And these other statements, you'll see kind of throughout the Talmud that this is like the guiding philosophy of what they want to do. They want to make sure that the Torah is not too strict, so they're patient in judgment, right? Raise many disciples. That's the transmission. You're going to be teaching and having new people to learn about it. And then the last part is to make a fence around the Torah. I think that we have a few minutes left of our free version of Zoom here, so we can pause here for any questions or comments. We have about 5 minutes left until it cuts us off.
So the idea of making a fence around the Torah, does that usually amount to rules being more strict?
It, I wouldn't call it strict in that sense. It's kind of like the best word is buffer zone. So it's kind of like it's going to take what the Bible says and it's going to give a little extra to make sure that there's no prohibition on that the person doesn't end up breaking a biblical law. So it kind of gives you some room to make sure that you are not doing that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get you. Just kind of to make sure that you're don't inadvertently break a commandment. So
Exactly.
make it,
Yeah,
instead of dawn, you got till midnight just to be safe.
exactly. And so you'll kind of find that throughout Judaism. So for example, you've probably heard of like the laws of kosher food, kosher diet, basically, right? So the Bible says that there are unclean animals, right? So that's obviously not eating pork, not eating shellfish, that kind of thing. It also says that you're not allowed to cook a kid or boil a kid in its mother's milk. That's a prohibition that occurs 3 times throughout the Torah. So that was interpreted to mean that you're not allowed to
A
cook.
calf or kid? Because kids are goats, right? I thought it was more focused on cows.
The word is it's referring to like a goat particularly, I think is the word that it actually uses. But it was interpreted to mean that you're not allowed to cook meat and milk, dairy products together. So you're not allowed to cook from them, and then you're not allowed to benefit from from that, and you're not allowed to. So that's the biblical prohibition. So that was extended in the rabbinic period to also include poultry and dairy. So you're not allowed to have chicken and cheese together because in that the rationale is that you might forget that it's actually meat, like red beef kind of things that you're not allowed to eat together, and you might make a mistake. So the rabbis prohibit chicken and duck and that kind of thing with dairy products. And then also the idea of so in ancient cookware you would have kind of like a cast iron skillet, so it retains the flavor of the things that you cook in it. So what ended up happening is that they also extended that to say that you're not allowed to use the same utensils to cook meat and dairy products. So if you have a cast iron skillet And I'm saying that on purpose for a reason. Like if you have a cast iron skillet and you cook a steak in it, you're not allowed to then go and use it the next time to cook a I don't know, like a Alfredo pasta, because it has dairy in it. And the concern is that the flavors are going to mix, and you're going to accidentally end up mixing them together and break a prohibition. So that's more examples of the fence around the Torah.
What do you think was the reason for that prohibition against cooking a calf or a goat in its mother's milk? Is it just seems wrong, or is there
Uh,
anything
yeah, there might be an
in
ethical kind
particular?
of, yeah, it might have originally come from like an ethical thing, like having the mother and having it cook, cooking the kid. It might come from that. I think I've seen that it might also have something to do with like Egyptian Canaanite kind of differentiation, like a means of the early Israelites to distinguish themselves from other tribes in the area. But
Right, right.
yeah, I'm not 100% sure though.
Yeah. No, I understand. It just seems like
Yeah,
a strange thing to do, but I guess we would do it like modern chefs would probably do it without thinking about it. Just cooking meat and some kind of dairy product or
yeah,
something like that. Chicken
it's
Alfredo.
yeah, and it's definitely become like more of a I think as time progressed, it became more and more of something that was kept, because I think the archaeology, uh, I think from what I understand, this is not something that I read up on, just because of personal connection to it. It's kind of I want some distance from that, from like the academics of it. But from what I understand is that the pork prohibition was really the most kept ancient prohibition, and the other things came later. That's what I understand.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But definitely by the time of I don't know if you guys have read Jonathan Adler's book. I have just started to read it, but it seems like from the Hasmonean period, this is when these the full Torah system was observed, like in a way that we would recognize it.
Yeah, I've watched some of his stuff. I haven't read his book yet, but it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I know
Um,
that they haven't found any pork bones like going way back even further
Yeah,
than that.
that's something
That makes
I kind
sense.
of I if I had the chance to interview him, I would ask that, because from what I understand, like Israel Finkelstein and some other people have found like an earlier uh lack of pig bones than what he's proposing. So I wonder how he would respond to that. But all right, well, I think we have about 1 minute left. So if you have any other comments, now's the chance to say them. If not, next week, what I'm going to do is we're going to go through Pirkei Avot, what we were just starting to do, which is looking at the ethical statements, because it's going to give more of like a vision for what rabbinic Judaism is, and you'll kind of be able to see more what the underlying philosophy is. And we'll use that in conjunction with the medieval text to understand how this developed through time. Sound good?
Yep.
All right. Nice to
That
see
would
you
be
guys.
nice.
See you next week.
Thank you very much.
Bye
Bye.
now.
See you guys later.
Have a good week.
You too.